Please sneak into the Like Button's house and remove all of their outlets and then replace it with a blank plate. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 29th, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. So they'd been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. So Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years. And so she had a hard time finding work. And for the last 2 years, she'd actually lived in a therapeutic group home. But it was a little after she had moved in there that she had very fortunately met Charlie. Now, on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin. He also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just going to pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy. And so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments, and visiting the park, and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated, and she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned a get together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she really wanted Charlie to come with her, since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie and really was excited for her life with him, at the current moment, as they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs, and being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get together with her family. And now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad, not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that, that Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concern to Charlie, he did go and wash out the dye from his face and got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with her family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room, listening to Charlie and their friend, Sam Hobson, talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she'd gone to her place, and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left. And then she called her mom. Dawn actually had three kids of her own, and two of them were adults. But her own mother, her Dawn's mother, had custody of the youngest child. And Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at this get together. And her mother had said yes. So Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom. And just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and the sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street or even at dumpsters and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around. So the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. And minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:30 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank a ton the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and he sat on the couch next to her and said good morning. And between Dawn not feeling that great physically and remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he got a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen. And then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts, but, they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money. And so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. And she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this. And she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten it? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug, and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out, she sprayed some on her wrist, and she rubbed them together, and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face, and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag down on her lap, And she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom. And then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now, and so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend Sam to shoot up some more heroin, because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door. And as soon as he opened it, he gasped because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and laid her on the floor. And he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp. And in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover. This is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on. That, Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic. But they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited. And so they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn. So he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived. And by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio. And sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics screamed inside, and at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful. Like more medical support meant that Dom was going to be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that John didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, the voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing. Don's heart had apparently stopped.
Julie, the shower ended 30 minutes ago. I know. I'm sorry, but
He's right. I'm with Nectar's legal team. According to Section 8A, it states that Nectar mattresses unparalleled comfort may lead to excessive slumber. This Friday,
you have 90 minutes to prove your innocence, or you will be executed.
everyone will have you on the edge of your seat until the very last twist.
What did you expect to happen?
Mercy will be guillotined. Thanks for all that superficially.
You got something to cheer for, like paying less for your trip. Score a great deal on flights, hotels, and rental cars on Kayak. You can compare options, track prices, and filter for what you want.
I used to be somebody. Back when hiring remote workers in 12 states broke the old software, and you needed a PhD just to find your pay stub in the new.
Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he was washed in panic phoned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by her commotion. They had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that. Because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here. He sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down. This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean. And this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent and being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different hour to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go stay up there after dawn. Now they were back at his place to pack up a bag both for himself and also for Dawn that they would bring to him at the hospital, and then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would kind of, clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here. He went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it went faster and faster as he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and goes into the living room and just sits down on the couch, feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs, because I always do drugs, and this is not it. I've never felt this way. And he looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me! Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" He began backing away, and Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was going to attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth. And then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up, and then the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Riley's treatment room while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever. He had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly, for the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. The doctor doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs, and the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user. And the apartment where they both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by life support machines, and Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs. It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was like poison in the drugs they took, perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 4th, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in her system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she'd taken some prescription psychiatric medication, and so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs. So he was waiting on those results. But admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him the answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point, they believed that maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment because some of the symptoms you get with a gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together that morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. Presumably, they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment, and then he feels sick. It didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak, you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus, you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So, all told, the gas leak theory seems to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to this strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England, so Dr. Jukes had pulled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning that matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, then they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they'd issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and to everybody else involved with the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals, just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt information from somewhere else and fast.
It's taken my family generations to perfect the perfect hurry. Haha, make perfect.
There's a reason Detective Johnson is the Gossip King.
Oh, did you hear? Jackie and Tom
Are getting a divorce?
Sad.
Well, I heard that Ashley.
Had worse than on her face?
Yeah, true.
Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. Injured? With over $25 billion recovered for our clients, there's a reason to go big.
Bathrooms?
Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm.
Some personality quirks are really fun. Like, I talk to my left foot more than I talk to my right.
You know what's not funny and not a personality quirk? OCD. Although the term OCD is widely recognized.
The next morning, July 4th, so 4 days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her three sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had had one of the nurses send them to one of the hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Dawn's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and when they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it. But now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case yet. But he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needs their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter the next day at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Dukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better, and she was doing better. She didn't want much. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life, and that's the path she was on. And so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not. But as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful. But he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her. And he hadn't gotten that. And none of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hand. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs, but they did show something else, something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was. Like literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Dawn and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital. Literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger. And it might already be too late. And so Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office. He picked up the phone and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits, swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Dawn and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the UK's Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's department, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie now wear a protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Dawn and Charlie and made them pack up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Dawn or Charlie. And others were contacting Dawn and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now, and those would often start taking more samples. He also had another team at Dawn's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so at this point, all Murphy, or anybody else for that matter, could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic, but specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened. And now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, with Dawn now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location Dawn and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one. And that was Charlie's apartment. And so Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits. They moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor, and open bags of fabric, and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters, and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during that response. And other areas of the place were littered with medical debris, like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsill. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Dukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from an overdose. But soon it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. and they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. An investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Don and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results, it was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper. That was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it belonged in this space, was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison, unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrist in excitement, she had accidentally exposed herself and Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities suspect were involved in this thing, they went back to Russia and have never been prosecuted. And Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of places you can go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and get more. All right, until next time, see ya.
Julie, hey, the shower ended 30 minutes ago. I know, I'm sorry, but hear me out.
On the afternoon of September 30th, 1991, an investigator in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, walked carefully through a college chemistry lab. It was also a potential crime scene. The room was a complete mess, with construction debris all over the place and lab equipment strewn across the countertops. In fact, it was so cluttered, the investigators didn't even know where to begin. But then he noticed something that really stood out. It was laying on a nearby counter. It was a soiled rag with a handwritten note sitting right next to it. And when he read the note, he gasped because he realized he could be the next to die. But before we get into today's story, you might be asking yourself, why is this a Monday upload? Well, get used to it because starting now, you're going to be getting a new episode every Monday. As mentioned in prior videos, I'm going to be uploading up to 4 new videos every week. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we do upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please steal all the mail in a Like Button's mailbox, and then just go ahead and restuff it with expired pizza coupons and mysterious credit card offers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of August 19th, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his packed lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work, but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, a really stressful process, and Bobby could definitely notice that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in her spirits, and while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they'd come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he'd always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9 to 5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of the science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkesville. He saw some of the guys on the crew standing out front, waiting to be let into the building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of the crew, got out of his car and said good morning to everyone, and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this crew, because by now Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, they had expected it to be totally prepared for them. All furniture, equipment would be cleared out, but instead they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their job that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days, basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted, and lately he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on the crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling fan. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on the crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting, and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even at a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit and drinking this disgusting liquid, and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched the Coke. All the guys got back to work. And so Bobby has a larger organization in Florida. And as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this will pass. And he just stood there on the ladder, And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass.
Has a smaller.
And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hard-working guy, he just pushed the
phosphorus.
sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring.
Electrons are further. They are indeed
but 4
further.
days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd,
atomic radius increases as you go
Bobby
down.
felt worse than ever.
So, yep.
As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, he was continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early.
Antimony.
But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them nope, he was just fine.
It is
and so Bobby
smaller.
would manage to get through that particular workday.
Argon,
but then
magnesium.
at the end of the day, when it was time to go home,
That's argon.
Bobby felt so relieved.
And that's
he could
magnesium.
not wait to just get home, roll into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking.
Compared to 3 atoms
something was wrong with him.
A lithium
So he went to his
atom
doctor.
loses a valence
But the doctor
electron
told him that despite
less
what
easily
he
than
was feeling,
potassium.
the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to go home and get more rest.
Lithium tends to be
so
less
that's exactly what Bobby did.
less reactive.
For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening,
The force of attraction
Bobby
between the
still
valence
felt
electrons and the
horrible.
nucleus
So
is
he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the
I
bathroom,
already watched this one.
but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother,
The
David,
force
to
of
come over to the
attraction
house
between
and
the
help.
valence electron and the
But even
nucleus
with David
is
there, who
stronger.
could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like, this was serious. And it clearly was not going away with rest.
Force of
like the
attraction
doctor
between
had said it would.
force of attraction.
So at some point that day,
Okay,
family called an
potassium.
ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital.
Force of attraction is
But by the time they
stronger.
got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain. And he also had begun to vomit.
Because
But after several hours
the,
of nonstop pain
farther
and nonstop testing
stronger
at the
because it's
hospital, the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his
experience is
family
the greatest
they
death.
actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby and it was treatable.
I'm going
They
to
diagnosed
crash
him
out
with
every
something
time.
called
It's
Guillain-Barré
always
syndrome,
the opposite.
which is a
of what I do.
condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerve
Smaller
and
first
causes tingling in the
ionization.
feet and hands.
Okay.
But the
know
staff
that.
assured Bobby that
Smaller
all he
first
needed was a very
ionization.
specific
Increase.
medication,
Okay.
and
Since
then he
less
would
energy
feel
is
a whole
required,
lot better. Bobby was
the
incredibly
force of
relieved,
attraction between
as
the
was his
valence
family,
less
and
energy
that
is
day he
required.
began taking the
Weaker.
medication,
The
and
force is
quickly
weaker.
his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually
Skip.
felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner
Oh my
here,
goodness,
and that everything
hour
really
and
was
5
going
minutes.
to be okay. But
Did
within
not get
just
that
a
extra
few
point.
days of being back home again, Bobby's
As you
pain came
move
back
left to
even worse
right,
than
the
before,
atomic radius
despite
decreases.
still taking this medication.
Valence
And he
electrons
also began experiencing a
closer.
new symptom. His hair started falling out.
Neon, then and lithium. Neon, lithium. Neon, all the way to lithium.
Why did you leave me?
I just want to show you all how.
Nice.
This way, let us both be done.
Wuthering Heights.
Get salon quality hair color at home. Connect with the licensed colors for free. Only at SallyBeauty.com.
What does I need to have to do coloring my hair? Anyway. As you move from left to right across
Dairy-free
period 2.
cashews and coconuts, not
Um,
caps.
The effective nuclear charge. The effective nuclear charge of Valence Electron experiences.
On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the
As
hospital,
you
he
move
was
from
back
left
there
to
again.
right across period 2,
And to Bobby's
effective nuclear
horror,
charge
this time his doctors
of Valence
actually seemed kind of
Electron
baffled by his symptoms.
experiences.
They told him
I think
that
they
sudden
decrease.
extreme hair loss was definitely
attention.
not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they
Effective
told
nuclear
Bobby that it
charge
seemed like
increases.
their initial diagnosis must have been wrong.
Nuclear charge
Despite the fact that the
increases.
medication they gave him to treat
And therefore the
GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem
all
now
the
was the
and
doctors
therefore
were
the
basically at a total
shielding by
loss
these
as to
electrons
how to help Bobby. They
stay
really
the same.
didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors
Okay,
would
I
test
spent an hour
after
and 8
test
minutes
on
on that.
Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so
Is that even
much and became
50%?
so constant that he basically fell into
That's
this
like-
almost
that's barely
delirious
50%.
state. Like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like all these tests did
Periodic
not provide
trends.
any clarity.
Introduction
And
to
so
chemical
basically, we
bonding.
can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical
Is
facility
this what
in
I- what
Hershey,
is this?
Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan
Chemical
walked
bond
down
is
the
an
hallway
attractive
of
force
the Baker
between atoms.
Hospital in Hershey,
Is this what I
Pennsylvania.
need to do?
He was heading to the room where
I
his
don't know
patient,
nothing about
Bobby
this.
Curley, was staying. And even from
When-
several yards down
I
the
don't think
hallway,
we learned any of
Dr.
this.
Brennan could already hear Bobby
Hold up.
screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this
Sodium
hospital,
and
his
chloride are
behavior
both
had gotten
solids at
more
room
and more
temperature.
unhinged.
I don't know.
At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room.
Indeed,
So now Dr.
sodium and
Brennan
chloride
had to
held
keep
together by
Bobby
chemical
physically
bonds.
restrained
Oh, that's a
to
chemical
his
bond.
bed.
Yeah, no, we
So
didn't do
Dr.
that.
Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was
Binary
screaming and thrashing
ionic.
around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby.
Identify the Lewis
He and his
structure.
staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to
Gotcha.
treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on
H2O,
this day, Dr.
that's
Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally
definitely-
did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But
It's
on September
only
22nd, so 6
because
days
it has
after
8,
Bobby
so it'd
arrived
be
in Hershey, he finally
this.
fell silent. Because on that day,
Yep.
he slipped into
No.
a coma.
It would be that because no.
3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very
be
defeated
that.
as he stepped into Bobby's
Okay.
hospital room. There, he
Lewis
saw
structure.
5 members of Bobby's family. His wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela,
CO2.
Bobby's adult siblings, Susan
Okay,
and
so
David,
C is
and
obviously in the
Bobby's
middle.
elderly mother, Mary.
C carbon
They'd all come to
has
be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly.
6
Dr.
valence
Brennan,
electrons.
He
So
took a
that
deep
means
breath,
that
and he
there's
said he had some bad news.
Um,
New test results had come back. And now, based on those results,
that means 4 more
they
is
knew what
needed.
was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family
And
that
oxygen
what Bobby was
has-
suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. When he said this, Dr.
only
Brennan
needs
watched the
2.
family for some kind of a reaction.
So why wouldn't that be
The family just
C2O2?
stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant.
But
So, Dr. Brennan went on and
It would be
explained
this
that
because-
thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its
H2
fumes. And he told them that, this is
C
really
is always in the
unusual
middle.
because thallium is
So,
highly
carbon-
controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have
It
accidentally
would
stumbled
be
upon. This is pretty
hydrogen
rare.
has
And so at this point, Dr.
one-
Brennan just paused
one-
and let the family sit with this new information.
carbon
And the
has
family, they looked
Yep,
at each
it would be
other
this.
like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say
nitroxyl.
anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just
NO
asked in a
minus.
quavering voice, what can we do? At that point,
Nitrogen.
Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning.
Nitrogen.
2 days later,
It
on
needs
September 27th, Joanne
1,
stood
2,
next
3.
to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all
Oh.
around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do
Okay.
was to take him off life
H2
support.
F2, right?
And so after giving the signal
C
to
in the
medical
middle.
staff,
So it's not.
Joanne, her daughter, and the
3 or
rest of
4
Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath.
Okay.
On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Colley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Colley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium, whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. I mean, this is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working.
They're on the table.
And they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records,
chlorine and
the first
oxygen.
things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived, and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag. Touch me and die."
Potato chips.
The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag, and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air.
No.
And so the investigators had finally decided that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for, meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby, because they would know about it.
How does
So at this point,
salt and potatoes smell like? How does salt and potatoes smell like? Thing.
I'm not playing with you. You're gonna get knocked out.
Thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days, so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level, because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose. But there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case, because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Colley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife.
I'm on a new one now, and
Joanne had been acting really strange.
I just gotta get 4 in a row.
Before and also after Bobby's death.
I said
David said when his brother had first gotten
Hold on.
sick, Joanne had barely listened
I'm on a
to
new
him.
one now, and instead of
She
showing
called
the
David
score,
to come over and
it says I gotta
help
get 4
acting
questions
like
right
she
in a
wasn't
row.
strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true.
It does
While
like
David
levels,
was
but I can't see
upstairs,
what level I'm on
literally
right now.
carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it.
4,
And Susan
6,
said, even though she
8.
didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Cauley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them.
What's an 8 on 8? But that's not.
Inside, he wasn't really
Oh,
convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, I mean, that was because she had asked him to do that after trying
Let's
at
see.
first unsuccessfully to move her husband around. And then when David was there, I mean, you know, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's like an explanation for that. And as for Joanne
The way
being
these cats
relieved
stretch is
after her
hilarious.
husband's death, you know, everybody dealt with grief differently.
F3.
And Bobby's death had been
Okay,
a
so
really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Cauley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby.
Nitrogen,
They saw each other quite a bit.
boron. I
David
think
in
they're like
particular
right next to each other.
spent a
Oh,
lot
no,
of
they're
time
not.
with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Cauley's attention, because it sounded
They only
like
need
David
one.
and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick.
Nitrogen needs
Cauley
3.
didn't know if this was relevant or not, but
And it
was
already
interesting.
has.
So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Cauley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Cauley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium. So that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. I mean, you know, Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. You know, maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Cauley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months. But he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had
1,
said.
2,
She said that she had never even
3,
heard of thallium, and really at no
4,
point had it
5,
ever crossed her mind
6.
that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium.
Got it.
As Cauley listened to Joanne tell this story, he
But
was
that
struck
would
by
make
a
sense
couple
why
of
it would be
things.
that.
First of all,
It
Joanne
would make
said
more
that
sense to be
Bobby had
ocean
been feeling
tattoos.
pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seems more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time.
I'll go. I'm trying to eat.
And the second thing
I
Cauley
don't
was
want
struck
carrier in my
by
mouth.
was actually just
Nope.
Joanne's
Nope.
general demeanor. She had just
Lay down.
recounted in
Lay.
detail, you know, the
Thank you.
story of her husband
Nope, lay down.
dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it,
she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like
Okay.
she's even upset about it.
C
And so at
in the
this
middle.
point, Collie was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right
C's in the
about
middle.
Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death.
H2,
And so,
that's
what Collie
hydrogen.
did is he stopped the other
Doesn't have
investigators.
anything,
He
so
leaned forward and he just asked Joanne
it's
point
not.
blank,
Okay.
how do you explain
And
how you
chlorine,
and your
2.
daughter were exposed to thallium? And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said
What's the
Bobby
difference
really
between...
liked to drink iced tea when he was at work.
That's
So
not...
every morning, she would
Wait.
fill his thermos
Nope.
up from this big pitcher
Yep.
of pre-made iced tea that she kept in the fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him
Hello.
to work.
Hello.
He would
Yep.
drink the tea all
Mhm.
day and then come home with the thermos.
Excuse me.
And some days, when he would come back, Bobby had
Chlorine.
not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some
Okay, we'll
left
put
inside
oxygen in the
thermos.
middle.
And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos
Oh, excuse
and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the
That
fridge,
means
basically to
that's
salvage
8
what
plus...
was left of the
Ooh,
tea. And
that's
she
8 plus
said
9.
she and her daughter
That's
also
15.
drank from that pitcher. So in
I mean,
essence,
that's
she sometimes
17.
was drinking from the same tea that
So,
Bobby was drinking from.
1, 2,
directly.
3,
And so
4, 5,
perhaps
6,
in
7,
that way,
8, 9,
if
10,
he was
11,
being
12,
exposed to
13,
thallium, maybe he was getting into that
14,
tea that he was
15.
bringing home, and you know, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover
No,
iced
where'd I
tea.
get you?
Collie glanced over at the
Damn.
other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't put it off. And Collie knew that, you know, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all 3 people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea. So it's a really small amount of
phosphorus,
thallium
fluorine.
that's coming back home. It's being mixed
Phosphorus,
inside the
trifluoride.
pitcher.
Cool.
And so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Ollie asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium.
That's, I mean, phosphorus,
He
fluorine.
was worried when he asked her this question that
That's
she might
7,
refuse or give some
9,
reason
that's...
that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation.
9,
UTI at 30,000
that's
feet.
16.
Good thing you can chat with an Amazon One medical provider from anywhere.
That's 8, 8, 8, that's not 16.
Discover Pre-Loved Ultra Luxury handbags, jewelry, and watches. Whether a uniform piece from Hermes or arm candy from Cartier, your next favorite is within reach. Fashion Style. Shop, sell, repeat.
Phosphorus only needs 3, so it would be this. It only needs 3, it doesn't have... Oh, because it appears? But it's the same thing for the bottom. I mean...
That same afternoon, Collie,
it's just the way that they're actually, like, formed. We didn't learn how they're supposed to be formed. We just, like, their shapes and everything. We didn't even learn this. I had to figure this out by myself.
And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told him about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and back again. Traces of thallium
H3?
were
What's
found
that?
on the little ridges at the top of the thermos.
How is that wrong? Oh, yeah, right.
And
I
this was
forgot.
huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed. Because when they tested the big pitcher of ice cream in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Cawley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Cawley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look.
Okay.
7 months later,
He needs two, one needs four.
Detective Cawley sat at his desk.
He needs two, one needs two, one needs four. So, what do you do?
One by one, they brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them on Bobby's desk.
You would have two
All of
things.
the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well-liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot. But they said the pranks had always been pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way beyond anything they ever did. At least, that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those two had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those two shot to the top of Cawley's suspect list. And so Cawley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Cawley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard of previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spin. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Cawley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them. Especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Cawley knew it would have to be a two, but that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Cawley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Cawley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Cawley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question.
Plus
where is
8,
the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Cawley was basically at a dead end.
That's 14.
He did not know how to take this case.
Plus 9.
Which was heartbreaking, because earlier that day,
17 plus 6.
That the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so, since Cawley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in
23.
One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Cawley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Cawley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door.
That's 23.
And once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Cawley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died.
That's 8.
And Cawley believes that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay.
He said in order to do these tests,
1,
they
2,
would
3,
have
4,
to
5,
exhume
6,
Bobby's
7,
body.
8, 9, 10,
The
11,
only
12,
person
13,
who could
14,
give
15, 16,
investigators permission
17,
to do
18,
that
19,
was
20,
Joanne.
21, 22,
Collie
23,
waited while Joanne
24.
processed everything she'd
Gotcha.
just been told. He tried not to let it
Gotcha.
show on his face,
Wait, whoa.
but Joanne's response to this
1,
would
2, 3,
basically
4, 5,
decide
6,
the
7,
entire
8,
fate of
9,
this
10,
case.
11, 12,
If she
13,
said
14,
no,
15,
there
16,
really was nothing they could do.
17, 18,
The
19,
evidence
20,
contained
21,
inside of
22,
Bobby's
23,
casket would be
24.
lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Collie went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Collie the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley.
See, middle.
The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him. And then all
Silicone goes in the middle.
But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos.
Let me see.
And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time. And they just kept on
Silicone
doing it.
needs like 4, right?
They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught.
Silicone needs 4, so it would be hours of this.
Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms.
Last
But finally,
question.
in August of 1991,
Oxygen in the middle,
Bobby started showing
fluorine.
really severe symptoms. Remember, his
So
legs
you
were
get
in extreme
oxygen.
pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew. They were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital. And while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda. And Bobby did so without any hesitation, because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer.
Okay, stage 2.
Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley.
Yeah, I know.
She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him. But investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly
Why do I have to do
when
this?
Bobby was
Like,
being
what am
poisoned.
I'm not even gonna do this on the test tomorrow.
Hairs that Bobby still had left on his body.
All of this?
Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker
The
was
first,
left behind
the
in his
level
hair.
1 was alright.
So as his hair grew
That's
out,
what I need to do.
the strands
We ain't getting
became
all that deep into
timelines
everything else.
that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Collie, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between
Molar
October
mass, no, we can do that.
1990 and September of 1991, these dates
Oh,
ruled out
excuse me.
Bobby's
Chemical
coworkers
reaction, we can
and
do
his brother
that.
David. The poisoning had
Oh,
simply
excuse me.
started too early for David to be responsible, and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the
So we got
timeline
so
barely
much to do
ruled in
that I don't even want to do it.
And when police began to
But
lie,
is that all I
Joanne
need?
might have wanted to kill her
Basically,
husband,
I'm done
they
though.
realized